Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now recently I asked the community what props they'd like to see built in upcoming videos. And much to my surprise, there was one answer that kept popping up. And that was the Holy Grail from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Now I realize now that maybe the choice of wording I used for the question might have led them down a particular path. But regardless, we're down that path, and so I'm going to make it. So let's get to it. As with any replica project, I like to start with a bit of homework. So I did a quick search online and found that a screen-used Grail prop was posted on the prop store website with tons of photos and measurements. So with references in hand, I hopped over to my favorite 3D modeling software and got down to business. I'm able to import the reference photo into my project and can set the image scale before I start tracing its outline with the line tools. Because I'll be using this 3D print as a base, I'm just going to trace half of the profile, and then after selecting that profile, I'll be able to use the revolve tool to revolve it around the vertical axis to create my final shape. This will make for a great base to build off of, but I'll get to that in a minute. At this point, I just needed to finalize my file and send it to my printer to let the printer do the work. Now if you didn't want to 3D print it or didn't have access to one, you could sculpt the Grail from clay, foam, or even use an existing goblet to make your own replica. And once the printer was finished, I could remove it from the enclosure and it was time to do a bit of sanding. I used this as an opportunity to add some unevenness to the surface, which should help to make it look more like the cup of a carpenter, as Indy describes it in the movie. And after a quick bath to remove any remaining dust, it was time to give it a more handmade appearance with the help of some acrylic modeling paste. This modeling paste has the consistency like caulking, but once it's dry, it can be sanded or even drilled into, so it's the perfect material to make this look like it's fired clay. I brushed it on thick inside the goblet since those print lines were hard to reach, and then I applied it randomly across the rest of the surface before setting it aside to dry. Now that the modeling paste was completely dry, I could smooth it out with a bit more sanding. As you can see, it's not completely flat and has all sorts of nicks and bumps, which should help to add to the realism of the prop. With the Grail fully prepped, it was time for paint, starting with a gray primer. Then I followed it up with a matte black spray paint, and then finally a satin clear coat. Then it was time to break out my Lazy Susan and mix up a bit of gold acrylic paint for my airbrush. Because the acrylic is thinned with water, you'll want to apply this layer in a few light coats with a bit of dry time in between to keep your paint from running. Off camera, I applied another layer of clear coat to seal in our gold paint, and then it was time to start aging. And for that, I'm going to need some hairspray. This technique is a favorite of mine. The hairspray creates a thin layer between the gold paint and the paint I'll be applying over the top, but with a bit of water will cause any top coat to flake and chip away, exposing the gold beneath it. If that was confusing, don't worry, it'll all make sense here in a minute. After applying the hairspray and giving it a bit of help with a hairdryer, I can mix up a reddish-brown clay color in acrylic and brush it over the entire surface and let it dry. It's okay if this isn't the most solid coat. It'll actually help give the finish more variety. Now that it's dry, I can grab a brush and some water and will start scrubbing away at my top layer to expose the gold underneath. This doesn't take a lot of effort, and you'll start to see immediate results, but don't overdo it. We want just a hint of gold here and there. When I'm happy with how it looks, I'll let it dry and then apply more clear coat to lock in our paint. And then it was time to get dusty. Based on the reference photos, the Grail looked like it had been dusted with an off-white paint to help age and blend the overall color a bit. So I'm going to follow suit with some off-white spray paint that I dusted across the surface from about 2 feet away. You'll want to keep the can moving so that you don't end up with too much paint in any one area, and definitely make sure to get some along the underside. At this point, the paint was starting to feel a little flat in comparison to the reference photos, so I grabbed my clay color and with a dry brush, added a bit more paint to help give it some depth. Once that had dried, it was time for the most challenging part of this project: gold leaf. Or imitation gold leaf. Look, I don't have the budget for the real stuff. In order for the leaf to stick to the Grail, I needed to apply some glue to the inside of the goblet, and once it was tacky, I could apply the leaf. Which sounds like a simple thing, but I found that it was much more difficult than expected. The first problem was that the glue went from wet to tacky to dry very quickly, and so only half of the leaf wanted to stick. Then I applied a bit more glue and went right into applying the leaf, only to find that the glue was still drying faster than I could apply it. At this point, I switched gears and went with something I was more familiar with, and shot some spray adhesive inside the cup, and then got my gold leaf applied and the excess brushed away. And here's where I'm at. It's got some texture, but then again so does the reference, so I'm going to count that as a win. It was at this point that I looked at my references again and decided that it needed a bit more of that off-white dusting, so I repeated the process and let it dry. Then I grabbed some 000 steel wool and rubbed it across the surface of the Grail to help give it a more mottled appearance that more closely mimicked the patchiness and striations that were visible in the reference photos. And after all of that, I could call it finished. Now, I know this wasn't a Star Wars or Halloween project, but it's always good to step outside of your comfort zone and try something a little different. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.